Hi there, and welcome to week 3 of our discussion of intercultural communication. Now, if you remember some of the things we've been talking about the last few weeks, you'll remember that we've been speaking about culture as being this this bubble or this iceberg that we have that it has so much depth to it. And I appreciate the quote from Hall, which I give to you here, where he talks about culture hiding more than it actually reveals. And what it hides from its own participants, and that we're often blind to the realities of what our culture actually hides and reveals to us at the same time. And that is why so often there's misunderstandings that occur. So I think it's important for us to become aware of those. As I say, the iceberg is often a very helpful definition or a very helpful metaphor for us to begin to see that so much of what we truly hold to as being true and important are actually things that are well beneath the surface. We can't even articulate them sometimes. We certainly are most often unconscious of those things, but they're there. And we talk about things like unconscious bias, and that is a bias that occurs not because we have consciously thought through those things and have made a logical kind of decision, but it's something that just comes intrinsically to us. Now, sociologists have identified over the years what they call global clusters. And these global clusters are essentially places in the world which, generally speaking, have certain cultural characteristics. Now, of course, when you try to subdivide entire countries and, in many cases, even entire continents into one specific way of thinking, you know immediately that that's going to be problematic. There are going to be many people that don't fit into those so-called norms. You're going to find many contradictions to that. And of course, as societies change, as the demographics of those societies change, so the global clusters begin to change as well. However, the global clusters are quite helpful for us because they provide a general framework of understanding by which we can look at certain cultural groups and almost say, in a general sense, these things are true over against somebody who thinks quite differently to those things. So we're going to look at some of those global clusters during the next week or so, and we're going to be thinking specifically of how they vary in terms of some of the value systems that we'll be talking about. Now, when we talk about value systems, what do we mean? Well, there are various different types of value systems. These are very generalized ideas, and they may even vary, as I said, from generation to generation in some cases. So try to avoid thinking of them as being a blanket truth, rather a societal norm. For example, the United States and Europe are classified as competitive cultures. Does that mean that every person in the United States has a competitive personality geared towards winning at all costs? No. But could it be said to be a general societal value? Probably. So let's unpack some of these values. First of all, let's look at individualism versus collectivism. As you can see from the diagram, an individualist is more focused on personal goals and attainments over against the group, whereas a collectivist culture generally tends to think about we rather than me. The most relevant and particular feature of individualism is seeing the individual person as being independent. There is an emphasis on personal responsibility, freedom of choice, personal autonomy, and achieving self-fulfillment. Moreover, individualists strive to maintain their distinctive characteristics and opinions over against self-directed behavior. They tend to see themselves as unique and different from others. Emphasis is often placed on individuals' goals over against group goals. In individualistic cultures, social behavior is often guided by personal goals, sometimes even at the expense of other types of goals. Individuals, as they're growing up, as they're young, are encouraged to pursue and develop their own abilities and aptitudes. Whereas collectivism, on the other hand, values the personal relationships and benefiting from the group, which is more important than achieving my own individual goal. Collectivism is linked to a sense of duty to a group, an interdependence to others, a harmony. In collectivistic societies, group goals have precedence over individual goals. Collectivistic cultures stress values that serve the in-group by subordinating personal goals for the sake of preserving that particular in-group. Collectivistic cultures, people are not seen as isolated individuals. They rather see themselves as interdependent with others. Now, when you're thinking about individualists, to add some further emphasis to this, they value personal independence, as we've said, promoting the self, which is the talent and potential of each person, pursuing and developing your own abilities, which, by the way, as we talk about these things, we're not contrasting a good way of thinking against a bad way of thinking. I certainly wouldn't want any of you listening to this video to be thinking, okay, so which one of these is the right way to think or the right way to be? The reality is, as we've said so far in these videos, is that these are value systems. These are things that we grow up with and very often we're unconscious of. It is not a matter of saying one is right, one is wrong. It is simply a matter of us understanding where I'm coming from and why my default response is what it is. And of course, along the way, we might want to make some changes, some adjustments to our behaviors as we find them incongruent with the sort of person we want to be. But, for example, in pursuing our own development and abilities, as is very prevalent in individualistic societies, that is not a bad thing. But it can be if you go to a culture that is highly collectivist, where people don't tend to think that. They tend to think of working with a group. There's a sense of duty to a group, even if that means that I don't get to achieve my own individual goals. So if you had to contrast, how do individuals can perceive themselves in individualistic and collectivistic cultures? An individualist would say, I'm distinct and unique. A collectivist would say, I'm a member of a family. Individualists think, what do I gain? Collectivists think, how will this affect others? And so on. Interestingly enough, some studies that have been done about behavioral traits that are often associated with individualism and collectivism. And again, as you look at these behavioral traits, don't think of them as good or bad. You can probably look at both sides of the spectrum and say, there's good things in both of these. For example, having optimism and a high self-esteem, which is prevalent in individualistic cultures, is a good thing. But having a sensitivity to embarrassment and the need for affiliation, those are good things too. So it's just simply about being different. So how do I deal with somebody who's highly individualistic? Well, one of the things you can emphasize is making sure that you are very much focused on the needs of the group and allow them to be autonomous in the way in which they deal with life. With collectivists, allow time for consultation and consensus building. Recognize the importance of these lasting relationships. It is very important that you allow for people to begin to see a bigger picture of themselves within this grid of understanding. So now let's turn our attention to low context and high context cultures. What do we mean when we talk about low context versus high context? Here's a very, very important concepts to understand. Here's a picture that might describe that for you. A low context culture has a very direct way of speaking. A high context culture relies a lot more on implicit understandings, as opposed to simply making sure people understand what is being said. Again, some helpful ideas to think through there. With low context communicators, we look to be direct and explicit, focus on getting our message across very clearly as we speak. With high context communicators, recognize the importance of silence and reflection. Sometimes it's not so much about what is being said as it is what is not being said in the conversation that's important. Here's a very important one, and that is power distance. There's some very interesting studies that have been done about power distance as it relates to a whole myriad of professions out there today. For example, what does this picture communicate to you? Some cultures, like the United States, affirm equality for everybody, even though some form of inequality exists in the culture. Inequality can occur in areas such as prestige, wealth, power, human rights, and even technology. This is what Geert Hofstede, who was in some ways the father of these ideas of global clusters and value systems, calls power distance. The distance between those that have power and those that do not. For example, what you see in this picture. Depending on your own background and your own cultural disposition, perhaps even your own faith position, you will see some very different things just by observing this picture. One of the greatest examples in modern history of a failure to understand power distance occurred a few years ago in the San Francisco air disaster. You can look the video up on YouTube if you like. But what happened in this air disaster was quite simply a problem in relation to power distance. The pilots and the flight crew disagreed on how they ought to deal with a specific situation as it related to failure of some equipment. Fortunately, the result was the flight crew, who understood that there was a problem, did not speak to the pilots because of the power distance between those two groups of people, and the plane ended up crashing. So with low power distance people, it's important to de-emphasize the formalities, to strip away some of those artificial, at times, boundaries between people, whether it be according to hierarchy or age. Allow them to question and challenge the authorities. But with high power distance people, follow that chain of command very carefully. Speak to people using the proper titles that they have. Be very formal and don't question authority, especially by the public. We'll pick up on some more of these value systems in the following videos.